Hey guys, let's talk about confusing anime. There are all sorts of anime films and series out there that leave people scratching their heads for all sorts of reasons. We have stories like Serial Experiments Lain and Ghost in the Shell, which tackle issues of technology and identity, and often require several viewings to fully grasp. We also have series like the original run of Evangelion, whose plot just sort of falls off during the last couple of episodes, and whose creators messed around with philosophy and nonlinear storytelling, a move that ended up alienating a lot of viewers. And who can forget the wealth of poor quality dubs and subtitles, which completely obscure the original story? Well, today I want to discuss a uniquely baffling anime called Armitage III Polymatrix.
Captain Ross Syllabus was looking for a new life. What he didn't expect was a new partner.
The name's Armitage.
Armitage III.
And right away, even the title is confusing. Most people who look at this title are going to see the third and assume that this is part of a series. Like, if there's a third, then there has to be a first and a second, right? But no. At the time this film was made, there were no others in the series. So Armitage III is actually the first entry. And even beyond that, it's pretty unclear what a polymatrix is in this context. Like, what information does this subtitle give us about the film, except that it might use generic science fiction-y sounding language? Maybe the description on iTunes can help us out. Let's see. Armitage is a brash cybernetic cop with a racy wardrobe who patrols a Mars metropolis. She and her stoic partner, Syllabus, risk everything to track a killer who is revealing his female victims' identities as highly advanced androids. Well, it sounds simple enough. Alright, to be honest, I sort of have a personal history with this film. Back in the day, I used to rent it sometimes from the video store, and even though I remember liking it overall, I also remember feeling like I never had any idea what was going on. I even used to think like, wow, I can't understand anything that's happening. This anime must be super deep. It actually took me a few years to find out just why this film is as confusing as it is. But before we get into that, I thought I would share the experience of Armitage III with all of you today. So the film opens with our protagonist, a detective named Ross Syllabus, arriving on Mars to begin a new assignment. While his shuttle lands, he has a dream/flashback sequence about his previous partner dying in the line of duty. I'm sure this won't come up again later. Anyway, things get confusing right off the bat. As Ross's shuttle lands, we see a suspicious figure doing something. I think he's supposed to be trying to sabotage the shuttle here. Then we start getting flashes of other suspicious figures, interspersed with shots of police arriving. While all of this is happening, we also start to see the shuttle's interior as it makes a rough landing. Keep in mind, aside from Ross, we haven't been introduced to any of these characters yet, and it's very unclear where any of this is happening, or even where any of these characters are in relation to one another. All we can really glean from this sequence is that there are bad guys doing something at the shuttle port, and some police are there trying to stop them. Then, suddenly, we cut to Ross, navigating through a quiet and peaceful shuttle port. So, what happened with his shuttle being sabotaged? And where are the criminals and the police? Well, as Ross is still trying to get his bearings, he runs into the criminals, who I guess are fleeing the scene. They're now suddenly carrying a suspicious suitcase and are being tailed by the cops. And this is where we get our formal introduction to the title character, Armitage.
This is the Martian Police Department, Detective Syllabus. Did you have a nice trip?
Anyway, while she's firing on the criminals, one of her shots hits the suitcase he's carrying and it bursts open, revealing the dead body of a woman. The perpetrator then tries to flee while Armitage chases after him. Ross attempts to follow, but unable to keep up, he returns to examine the body. And all of a sudden, Armitage is just there again, explaining to Ross that the victim was a famous country singer. I'm not kidding, we see her jump out of the window and onto the criminal's getaway car, and then literally 30 seconds later, she's standing directly above the victim, identifying her body. The following exchange ensues.
Oh, what's your name?
The name's Armitage. Ooh, what a sexy back. I just love broad shoulders.
Hey,
What was that for? I was just being nice.
listen. What's going on here? Is this somebody's idea of a sick joke? Annie Oakley here isn't even human.
So yeah, first of all, I'm pretty sure that grabbing your partner and groping his back the first time you meet him would probably qualify as sexual harassment in the workplace. But more importantly, we discover that the body the criminals were transporting isn't actually human, but is some sort of android. And upon learning this fact, Armitage's attitude suddenly cools. She immediately leaves the crime scene, claiming that since the body isn't human, it's no longer under Martian police jurisdiction. But in the very next scene, we're told that the Martian police have formed an investigative squad to solve the crime, and both Armitage and Ross are at the briefing. So apparently the crime was under Martian police jurisdiction, and Armitage just chose to abandon the crime scene? Anyway, one of the officers at the briefing explains that the body in the suitcase belonged to an extremely advanced type of android.
As I mentioned, her physical construction was created organically, but it was done using a technology much more advanced than the second series models. I believe that the victim was a prototype built outside of regulations. It could also, mean that there are other illegal models like her running around under our noses.
Okay, that line right there about there being robots running around under our noses, let's put a pin in that for now. Anyway, the cops start wondering what happened to the real country singer since the one in the suitcase turned out to be an android. But the idea starts to circulate that the singer might have been a robot from the beginning. Okay, so the plot is actually pretty clear so far, right? There's been a murder or an attempted murder, and it's up to Ross and Armitage to figure out what's going on. Let's see how long it takes for things to become needlessly convoluted. We next get a scene of Armitage showing Ross to his new apartment. While the two are looking around, Ross turns on his TV, where coincidentally the station just so happens to be airing a message it received from the killer. In case there was any doubt in our mind, the message shows the man from the shuttle port murdering the victim, in pretty graphic detail. So I guess what happened here was that the news station received a literal snuff film, and instead of bringing it to the authorities, they decided to air it on TV. And this is pretty much the last time we ever hear about this broadcast, too. You might think that since the killer sent this footage in, maybe there's something in it that the police could use to track him down? Something that could further the plot, maybe? I don't know. I guess it doesn't matter because the Martian police never follow up on this lead. The following morning, Ross reports in for his first official day on the job. While he's out driving somewhere, he encounters a mob of anti-robot protesters. He then has a flashback to a conversation he had with his boss that morning. And sorry if it seems like I'm jumping around a lot here, but part of what makes this movie so hard to understand is its editing. It seems like the film is constantly jumping back and forth from one place or time to another, not really taking the time to establish a scene. 1 minute we'll be in a location, and then suddenly we're in another location, flashing back to a scene in yet a third location. It starts to feel like anime Inception sometimes. Anyway, the police chief tells Ross that since the victim was an android, the crime isn't being treated as a murder. The police are still interested in it, though, because the technology used to create the android was most likely illegal. Flash forward to the present, and we find Ross arriving at a place called Conception. And just as a nitpick, look at the sign in this shot, and then look at this one. See? It's spelled right in this shot, but then spelled wrong in the next one. Anyway, Ross comes across another anti-robot protest on the steps of the Conception building. Inside, he encounters Armitage, who's yelling at an android worker, going full Karen and demanding to see someone named Asakura. When the android refuses her request, Armitage threatens to assault her until Ross intervenes. Part of what the scene establishes is that there are actually a few different types of androids in this world. There are seconds, which are basically just simple artificial intelligences, not that different from, say, a chatbot. Then there are more advanced types called thirds. That's where the title of the film comes from, Armitage III. Anyway, Ross grabs Armitage and tosses her into his car. He tries to ask her what she was doing at the Conception building, but she claims that it was private. And I can't help but notice here that we were never told to begin with why Ross was at Conception either. In fact, it isn't until the characters are out in Ross's car that Armitage finally reveals what this place even is and what it has to do with the investigation.
By the way, I've already done some legwork. Conception was the company that set the standards for the seconds. So, there you go. But, I still pity them. The other manufacturer, Hugite, passed them up and it killed their aspirations, but that's the way it always goes.
So based on that, I guess that this Conception place is an android manufacturing company that isn't doing too well. Not like it really matters, since the characters never bring this visit up again. Much like the killer's televised message, the visit to Conception just kind of vanishes into the ether. The pair decide to get something to eat, and we're given a short sequence of Ross and Armitage walking through the Martian streets. And I just want to take a moment here to talk about the animation. The visuals in this film are very hit and miss, like you can really see on screen where the movie's budget went. But when it hits, it definitely hits. This film can be downright gorgeous at the best of times, and the action sequences especially feel very fluid and well choreographed. Call it nostalgia, I guess, but I've just got a soft spot in my heart for these old 80s and 90s hand-drawn animes. Anyway, this all leads up to Ross and Armitage getting ice cream together. They start to eat, and apropos of nothing, Ross just starts suddenly going off about how androids can't be trusted. He says basically that machines can only ever copy us and pretend to be human.
Well, I'm sick of all these cyborgs and humanoids and machines that only seem to copy us. Since I'm allowed to make a choice, I choose not to like something that pretends to be human.
Armitage responds by looking devastated and storming off. And because Ross is an idiot who can't read the room, he just stares helplessly after her like a Neanderthal, clueless as to what he possibly could have done to upset her. Flash forward to some time later. Armitage and Ross apparently met up again off-screen, and finally we see them doing some actual police work. They visit a bar to speak with the manager of the singer who was killed. As it turns out, though, the guy is completely drunk and he just keeps ranting about how she couldn't have been a robot and how she was the most human woman he knew. Armitage deals with the situation by assaulting the man and stalking off. Again. Ross chases after her, and the pair have an argument in the parking lot, leading to this exchange.
Don't you understand? All of McCannon's talents, personality, and dreams were inside that machine.
Oh my god.
Yeah, what is it?
I didn't realize.
So, a mere 23 minutes into the movie, Ross finally catches up with the audience and realizes that Armitage is an android. If only he'd had a hint or two along the way. Anyway, Ross gets a call from Central. As it turns out, there's another third-type android out there who's claiming that she's getting death threats from the same man who killed the singer. She's calling into the police requesting to speak to Armitage. Unfortunately for her, and I mean really unfortunately considering what's about to happen, Armitage has stalked off for yet a third time, leaving Ross alone to handle the situation. He jumps into his car and then starts seeing footage of a bunch of androids being gunned down. I guess these are more of the killer's victims. Ross wonders why they're all females before rushing off to help the caller who had asked for Armitage. In the middle of all this, we start seeing footage of the murderer who has apparently hacked into a news station. He introduces himself by name as Renee Dan Claude and then shows a picture of the same woman Ross is rushing to help. Dan Claude announces that there are third-type androids disguising themselves as humans all throughout the city and outs Ross's caller as one of them. As a result, by the time Ross reaches her, she's already been attacked and burned alive by an angry anti-robot mob. Right as she's dying, though, she sends a message to Armitage, which begs the question, if she could contact Armitage directly all along, why did she bother calling into the police earlier? I don't know, maybe she just sensed that Armitage was off on her own, sulking like a child. Anyway, the dying android sends Armitage a list of all the other androids living as humans in the city. She mentioned earlier that she got the list from Pluto, but didn't mention who or what Pluto was. And just before she dies, the android manages to send one last message to her girlfriend.
Goodbye, Jessica.
Wait a minute. Jemmy? Is this supposed to say Jenny? Or is Jemmy actually this character's name? Alright, anyway, now things start to get really confusing. We cut to Ross somewhere, and he just so happens to spot Dan Claude in a completely empty street. How very, extremely convenient. Ross gives chase, and the pair end up in a church for some reason, and then Ross starts having PTSD flashbacks of his murdered partner. Remember her? From the beginning of the movie? As it turns out, she was killed by a robot, which I guess explains Ross's bigotry. Luckily, he gets over his PTSD within a couple of seconds, and a fight scene ensues. Armitage joins in the action, and, long story short, manages to subdue Dan Claude. She almost kills him, but Ross stops her.
Don't do it! Just cuff him. You're a police officer first, Armitage, and you know what your duty is. Armitage, it doesn't matter that you're a third. You're a cop. And you're my partner.
Aw, that's pretty sweet. Then this happens. But don't worry, folks, she's alright. She landed in the water. We get another anime Inception scene with Ross driving while having a flashback of talking to his boss. As it turns out, Armitage has disappeared. Again. The chief tells Ross that he thinks the killing of the androids might have something to do with Armitage, but calls her a good cop. And Ross thinks to himself,
Armitage isn't a good cop. She's a great one.
sorry, a great cop? Citation needed? So far we've seen Armitage sexually harass a coworker, abandon a crime scene, assault a witness, threaten to assault a woman, or I guess an android, so threaten to destroy someone's property maybe, and abandon her assignment while on duty on 4 separate occasions, and one time led to an android woman's death. So how exactly is she a great cop again? Let alone a good one? Let alone an employed one? Anyway, while Armitage is gone, another android is killed. While surveying the crime scene, Ross wonders out loud who keeps doing this. One of the other cops on the scene tells him that the only 2 people with the capability to keep murdering the androids are Renee Dan Claude and Armitage. Since Dan Claude is presumably in police custody, that means that the main suspect is suddenly Armitage. So first of all, why are Dan Claude and Armitage the only 2 who could have murdered the latest victim? She was killed by multiple bullet wounds. It seems like any idiot with a gun could have done it. The cop on the scene also tells Ross that their boss had suspected Armitage for quite some time, and there's already a warrant out for her arrest. But what about all the footage we saw of Dan Claude murdering the country singer? Or what about the broadcast where he outed that one android and got her killed by the angry mob? This guy has confessed multiple times to being the killer and has backed his claims up with some pretty solid proof, so I guess they're assuming that Armitage is now a copycat killer? Or is the idea that she's been in on it with Dan Claude the whole time? And what was all that about Armitage being a good cop? Okay, whatever. So as they're investigating, Ross comes across a message that was sent to the victim by someone named Pluto. Remember that name from before? It's the same person who had contacted the previous victim with the list of third-type androids. Anyway, Pluto claims to be an android too, and says that he's sending his message through the use of Armitage's ID, whatever that means. Ross asks his colleague to trace Pluto's message, and then we get a scene of Ross finding Armitage at a playground. So I guess we're supposed to infer that Ross found her by tracing Pluto's message? I don't know, it's never explained. Ross warns Armitage that the police are after her, but she's suddenly very determined to join him in the investigation. I guess it wasn't really worth her time when other androids were dying, but now that she's a suspect, all of a sudden she's all in on solving this crime spree. Anyway, the 2 go somewhere, it's never really clarified, and Armitage immediately finds Pluto. Well, that was easy. How did she find him? How does she know it's him? No time for any of that. Pluto tells Armitage that he's creating a backup of himself, which I'm sure won't come into play later. He also claims to know where to go to find out why the third-type androids were created in the first place. So I guess how all this works is that there are third-type androids infiltrating the populace on Mars, and they know that they're androids posing as humans, but they don't know why they exist. I think? So Pluto takes Ross and Armitage to another location, some kind of memory bank, Pluto calls it, but as they're sneaking inside, they trigger the building's security. They get into a fight scene with a robot, which turns out to be operated by Renee Dan Claude. How is he here? Why is he here? I guess those are stupid questions. Armitage manages to defeat him, and since Ross was injured during the shenanigans, she and Pluto leave him behind. This scene ensues.
Security should be here any minute. I'm sure they'll take care of you.
No, you don't have to run and hide now. Officers don't leave their injured behind. You're cold, lady.
I will always be cold.
I guess this is meant to be a deep moment or something, but honestly all I can think about here is a very similar scene between Brock Sampson and Molotov Cocktease on the Venture Brothers.
Still? After all these years? Ah! I thought the Cold War was over!
It's always cold in Siberia.
Afterwards, we get a scene of Ross in the hospital getting some new cybernetic parts. One of the other cops comes to visit him and give him an update on the case. As it turns out, the country singer who was murdered at the beginning of the film was actually pregnant. So yeah, the androids who are being targeted have the ability to conceive. Once Ross is out of the hospital, he pays a visit to his boss, who informs him that the investigation into the murdered androids has been closed. The police chief states that the case has been solved since the murderer, Dan Claude, has been apprehended. Ross apparently told him about the second Dan Claude at the memory bank, but the chief tells him basically that he doesn't believe him. So, putting everything at the memory bank aside, what about all of the androids who have been killed since the first Dan Claude's arrest? Because the film makes it clear that the murders continued after he was arrested. And what was all that about Armitage being a suspect? Cut to Armitage and Pluto, who I guess are still trying to get into the memory bank. The scenes with Ross made it pretty clear that at least a couple of days have passed since the battle with Dan Claude, so I have no idea what these two have been up to since then. Pluto reminds us that all of his data has been backed up, so if he dies it can be recovered. But I'm sure this won't come up again. Anyway, Pluto finds the server, or whatever, that they're after and hooks himself up. He manages to recover a photo from the Conception Company, remember them? And the photo includes Armitage's designer along with Dan Claude. But just as Armitage is trying to find out what the connection is between Dan Claude and her designer, Pluto starts attacking her. Apparently he downloaded some pretty bad malware. Armitage manages to defeat the malware, but Pluto dies in the process. Who could have possibly seen this coming? Armitage manages to contact Ross asking for his help. The pair meet up and Ross reminds Armitage that Pluto told them his data has been backed up. And I'm not joking, this is the last time we ever hear about Pluto. The characters openly discuss how they might bring him back, but after this conversation is over, at no point in the film do they make any attempt to actually do so. Instead, their next move is to essentially declare war on the Martian police and attack the hospital where Dan Claude is being held under heavy guard. After fighting their way inside and killing the shit out of countless innocent officers who are just doing their jobs, they manage to find Dan Claude. But just as they're about to abduct the prisoner, they're attacked by Dan Claude. And I have to admit, I'm still pretty confused as to what's going on here. We already know that there are two Dan Claudes because Ross and Armitage managed to subdue and presumably arrest one of them, but then they encountered another at the memory bank. This one here is the one that Armitage fought and almost killed at the memory bank, so I originally assumed that the other one here was the one that Armitage and Ross had arrested. But when he wakes up and sees her, this Dan Claude acts like he's never met her before and says that she must be Asakura's daughter. So I think the idea here is that this is the original human Dan Claude, and the others are robotic copies. But if that's the case, what happened to the one that Armitage took down? Was he not arrested? Did they just let him go? Or are both the original and one of the copies being held by the police at the same time? Well, who knows? Armitage fights one of the Dan Claudes and manages to kill him. Cut to Ross and a fellow cop meeting in a cemetery. Well, a former fellow cop, anyway. We're told that after their assault on the hospital, both Armitage and Ross are now wanted criminals. Ross asks his former colleague to help him find a place called Dunwich Hill, and in the next scene we find Ross and Armitage heading out toward the mysterious location. So, what happened with Dan Claude? I know one Dan Claude was killed by Armitage, but what about the other one? The one that the pair abducted? I'm guessing he's the one who told them about Dunwich Hill, but since we never see him again, we're just left to come to our own conclusions. Anyway, we're basically at the end of the film at this point. Long story short, this Dunwich Hill place was where Armitage and all of the other androids were created. They were designed by a man named Asakura, who reveals that their original purpose was to help with low birth rates on Mars, which is why they're able to conceive. So, if I understand correctly, these androids were sent out, by the government I guess, to infiltrate the populace and bear children. But with all the anti-robot sentiment on the planet and some boring political backdrop, the androids basically went out of fashion and the government decided to eliminate them. That's why the Dan Claude androids were created. And by the way, there's another Dan Claude android here, but he's a good guy, I guess. All the others, we learn, were designed as assassins to quietly eliminate the birth-giving androids. Well, maybe not quietly eliminate them. The Dan Claude androids seem to want to destroy their targets as openly and publicly as possible, so I don't know. And by the way, remember Pluto? He was also an android, but we don't get an explanation as to why he was created. As you might guess, Armitage isn't exactly thrilled to learn that she's an obsolete baby-making machine. After speaking with Asakura, she and Ross spend the night together and finally consummate their budding romance. When Armitage reminds Ross that she's an android, he says that he doesn't care since he's half robot at this point too. So, bigotry solved, I guess. The next day, Ross receives a call from his former boss. The police chief warns Ross that the military is planning to attack Asakura's laboratory since Armitage and Ross are now considered a threat to the government. A lengthy action sequence follows, with Ross and Armitage basically taking down the entire Martian military. Once it's finally over, the pair stand over the battlefield, vowing to find a quiet place somewhere that they can call a home. And with that, our movie comes to an abrupt end. Roll credits. So, overall thoughts on the film? Well, it was just as confusing as I remember. But why does Armitage III Polymatrix make so little sense? Why is it so confusing? Well, the answer can actually be traced back to a 4-part miniseries that was released in 1995. That series, simply titled Armitage III, was the first entry in the franchise. It told the same story we just saw, but over the space of 4 episodes, each running half an hour in length. Then, later on that same year, Ghost in the Shell dropped. Seeing the crazy success of that film, the creators of Armitage III decided to release a film of their own based on the Armitage miniseries. They then proceeded to hack and slash their way through the miniseries, creating the confusing but lovable mess that is Armitage III Polymatrix. I've actually watched the miniseries, and I gotta say, it is objectively better than the film. From what I remember, the miniseries does a much better job of establishing and fully fleshing out different scenes, which makes it a lot easier to follow. Also, since it's twice as long as the film, we're given a lot more exposition about things like the conception company, Pluto, and the story's political backdrop, which makes for a much smoother viewing experience. But with that in mind, I still have a soft spot in my heart for Armitage III Polymatrix. It may not be a perfect film, it may not even make sense, but it's a nice little nostalgia bomb with pretty animation and a cool cyberpunk feel. And apparently I'm not the only one who feels this way. Armitage III may not have achieved the runaway global success that some other anime has, but it's garnered a small but dedicated cult following since its release. But what do you guys think? Have you seen Armitage III? What did you think of it? I'd love to know in the comments. Until then, see you next time.